The rain had been falling in fine, relentless sheets over the city of Graymore, turning the cracked asphalt streets into rivers of dark, glistening liquid. Daniel Mercer, once a decorated Marine marksman, now sat hunched over a chipped metal table in a dimly lit diner on the edge of the industrial district. His coat, soaked through from the storm, clung to his lean frame, emphasizing the taut muscles that had once propelled him through the jungles of Southeast Asia. His eyes, cold and calculating, darted toward the window, noting the occasional passerby with the precision of a sniper observing a target. Despite the early hour, the diner had an aura of lethargy and neglect, the kind that made him feel simultaneously invisible and exposed. 3 weeks earlier, Daniel had been a man at peace with his routine: coffee at dawn, reading old newspapers, observing the quiet rhythms of the city he had defended in uniform decades ago. But that morning, everything had changed. A group of teenagers had entered the diner, loud and brash, their laughter cutting through the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above. They had not seen him before, or perhaps they did and did not care, but to them, he was simply an old black man taking up space in a world that seemed determined to ignore him. Their words were sharp, brimming with the arrogance of youth. "Look at this guy sitting here all alone. Probably been nursing that coffee forever." Daniel's gaze met theirs, calm yet intense, a storm brewing behind the gray threads of his hair. He said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch, thick and uncomfortable, until it was interrupted by the clatter of approaching footsteps outside. Within minutes, 3 police cruisers arrived, lights flashing, sirens muted but insistent. Officers Michael Patterson and Jennifer Walsh stormed through the diner doors, weapons drawn, eyes locking onto Daniel with a predatory certainty. "Hands, where we can see them," Patterson barked, his voice echoing against the tin ceiling. Daniel raised his hands slowly, showing no resistance, though the muscles in his jaw twitched subtly. He had faced ambushes, gunfire, and death before. He had trained his mind to read threats and neutralize them in microseconds. Yet nothing could have prepared him for the indignity of being treated like a criminal in the place he had once considered a sanctuary. As they handcuffed him, Daniel's mind raced, not with fear, but with analysis. He cataloged every detail: the badge number on Patterson's chest, the angle of Walsh's stance, the way the fluorescent light reflected off the linoleum floor. Every piece of the puzzle would be important. Outside, protesters began to gather, some shouting for justice, others simply curious about the commotion, their voices a distant echo against the roar of the city. The ride to Moran County Jail was tense, punctuated by whispered conversations between the officers speculating about his supposed criminal history. "You think he's one of those unstable veterans?" Walsh asked. Patterson shrugged. "Could be. You never know with these guys. Served in combat, comes back. And what then?" Daniel remained silent, his hands pressed against the cold metal of the handcuffs, each click a note in a melody of humiliation he had not chosen to play. By the time his arraignment came, 3 days later, the courthouse steps had become a theater of social tension. Media vans lined the streets, cameras trained on the courthouse doors, eager to capture every detail of the veteran accused of a crime no one seemed to understand. His attorney, Jennifer Walsh, not the same officer who had arrested him, was a recent law school graduate, brimming with idealism yet burdened by inexperience and an overwhelming caseload. She had less than an hour to review documents that would dictate the freedom of a man who had already been stripped of dignity once. Inside the courtroom, the process of jury selection was a microcosm of prejudice and preconception. Potential jurors openly expressed distrust of veterans, particularly those who had served overseas. "They come back messed up," one juror admitted. Daniel's military service, once a badge of honor, was now being twisted into a symbol of danger. Media coverage further fueled the narrative, focusing less on facts and more on drama, painting Daniel as a potential threat rather than a wronged man. The prosecution's strategy was precise and merciless. Witnesses were selected to emphasize supposed volatility in veterans, despite lacking direct knowledge of Daniel's history or character. Dr. Marcus Webb, a criminologist, testified that older veterans could pose greater risks to civilian populations, relying on hypothetical analysis rather than personal observation. The weight of Daniel's heroism, the countless lives he had saved, the missions he had completed, was systematically dismantled, replaced with fear, conjecture, and the latent racism of those seeking a convenient narrative. Throughout the trial, Daniel maintained a rigid composure, an unbroken veneer of calm that belied the simmering anger within. He recalled each mission with the clarity of someone who had lived through it. 6 hours under relentless fire, holding off enemy forces while evacuations took place, lives preserved through precision and courage. Yet the courtroom treated these feats not as evidence of valor, but as proof of capability for violence. At night, in the dim confines of his cell, Daniel reviewed the sparse notes his attorney had compiled, weighing each decision with the meticulous precision of a sniper zeroing in on a target. The concept of justice, once absolute in his mind, now appeared as a fragile illusion, easily shattered by politics, prejudice, and power. Outside the walls, his family endured scrutiny and harassment, a secondary assault on the very fabric of his life. As the chapter closed, Daniel knew that the true battle had just begun. His freedom, his dignity, and the legacy of his service hung in the balance. Somewhere, beyond the concrete walls and iron bars, forces were gathering, forces capable of turning the tide in a case where truth had become obscured by the shadows of society. The morning after Daniel Mercer's arrest, the city of Graymore seemed to hum with a low, anxious energy, as if the streets themselves knew that injustice had taken physical form. In the confines of his cell at Moran County Jail, Daniel sat, on the hard cot, his back straight, hands clasped together, mind working through every detail of the previous day. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting long, harsh shadows across the room, accentuating the concrete's cold texture. Even within these sterile walls, Daniel's mind was active. He recalled the arresting officer's exact words, the way they had exaggerated every subtle movement into a threat. He cataloged their expressions, their tone, the cadence of their lies, noting every point of leverage that might one day become part of his defense. Outside, the city buzzed with speculation, reporters painting the veteran as a dangerous predator, social media exploding with outrage and conjecture. Daniel had faced enemies on distant battlefields, yet the subtle cruelty of misinformation and prejudice was a battlefield of its own, a war fought in whispers, headlines, and courtroom spins. His attorney, Jennifer Walsh, young and idealistic, arrived at the jail later that morning. She carried a small leather briefcase, heavy with documents that had been hastily compiled. Though inexperienced, she possessed a sharp mind and a dogged determination, qualities Daniel respected. She set the briefcase down and gave him a quick nod, her eyes betraying both concern and frustration. "Daniel," she began, her voice low, "the prosecution is spinning a narrative that's almost impossible to dismantle. They've already started calling in expert witnesses who've never even met you." Daniel's gaze was steady. "Then we'll meet them with truth, Ms. Walsh. That's all we need." By mid-morning, the media frenzy outside the jail had reached fever pitch. Televised reports described Daniel as a potential threat, citing speculative psychological profiles and snippets of interviews with teenagers who had been in the diner. These stories, carefully edited to paint him as dangerous, contrasted starkly with the truth. Daniel had spent decades teaching young people, instilling in them values of honor, courage, and respect. Within the courtroom, jury selection became a battleground of perception versus reality. Potential jurors expressed subtle and sometimes overt biases. "You can't trust veterans who've been in combat," one said, while another whispered about men who come back changed forever. Daniel observed, noting the small tells, the hesitation, the faint flickers of judgment in their eyes. He cataloged them as if reading enemy positions, careful to remember every detail for when the time to speak would come. Meanwhile, the prosecution prepared to use fabricated narratives to their advantage. Witnesses were rehearsed to depict Daniel as a man whose military service had made him volatile and dangerous, though none had any direct evidence. Among them, Dr. Marcus Webb, a criminologist from Indiana University, specialized in theoretical assessments of veteran behavior. Daniel knew the danger. The jury would be impressed by credentials, not by truth. Outside, protesters gathered, some holding signs demanding justice, others simply curious. The atmosphere was tense, a mixture of fear, anger, and excitement, with a palpable undercurrent of racial bias threading through every interaction. Social media amplified every whisper, every rumor, every speculative accusation, shaping the narrative in real time. As trial preparations advanced, Daniel spent hours alone in his cell, revisiting moments from his past that could serve as evidence of his character, teaching history at the community college, mentoring students, leading Marines through harrowing missions in Southeast Asia. Each memory was a testament to his discipline and courage, but within the courtroom walls, such character was irrelevant. What mattered was the story the prosecution could sell, a story that distorted his heroism into menace, his service into threat. By evening, Jennifer Walsh had mapped out a strategy for cross-examination, knowing that every word, every gesture, every piece of evidence could tip the scales. "They've built a narrative on fear," she said. "We'll counter with facts, patience, and precision. Like you, Daniel. One step at a time." As night fell over Graymore, the city lights reflecting off wet streets, Daniel lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling. He understood that the war he now faced was not fought with rifles or artillery, but with deception, prejudice, and calculated lies, and he would need every ounce of patience, every shred of discipline, to survive it. The morning of Daniel Mercer's trial dawned gray and overcast, with a drizzle that made the streets of Graymore glisten like wet ink. Inside the courthouse, tension clung to the air, heavy and suffocating. Every step Daniel took echoed on the polished floors, a stark reminder of the weight of expectation pressing on his shoulders. He walked with the same military precision that had carried him through decades of combat, a disciplined figure cloaked in quiet dignity. The prosecution's courtroom had been transformed into a theater of fear. Media cameras lined the walls, journalists scribbled notes furiously, and spectators leaned forward in anticipation. The narrative against Daniel had been carefully orchestrated. He was no longer a veteran or a teacher. He had been recast as a dangerous predator, a relic of war who could strike without warning. Every aspect of his service was twisted to appear threatening, every honorable action cast in shadow. Jennifer Walsh stood beside him, reviewing notes rapidly, her brow furrowed. "They've got Dr. Webb first," she whispered. "Prepare yourself." The criminologist took the stand with the air of someone delivering indisputable truth. He had never met Daniel, never examined his military records, and had no first-hand knowledge of the case. Yet he spoke confidently about the supposed tendencies of older veterans, painting them as ticking time bombs prone to sudden violence. The jury nodded politely, impressed by credentials over reality. Daniel listened intently, noting every word, every inflection. He remained composed, a study in disciplined restraint, his eyes scanning the room for subtle tells and weak points. This was a different battlefield, one where the enemy wielded lies as skillfully as he once wielded his rifle. As Dr. Webb concluded, the prosecution called witnesses who had been coached to provide narratives that fit the carefully constructed image of Daniel as a threat. Tyler Morrison, one of the teenagers from the diner, gave his testimony under the careful guidance of the prosecutor. Each statement, each hesitation, had been meticulously shaped to suggest fear and intimidation, though the truth was far simpler. Daniel had merely asserted his presence, as any man of discipline would, in the face of juvenile arrogance. Outside, the courtroom protesters carried banners demanding justice. Some shouted Daniel's guilt, others demanded fairness. The murmur of the crowd seeped through the courthouse walls, a reminder that the battle was being fought on multiple fronts. Social media amplified every accusation, every distorted statement, shaping public perception before facts could even take root. Daniel's defense strategy relied on meticulous attention to detail. Jennifer Walsh cross-examined each witness with precision, pointing out inconsistencies and drawing attention to the implausibility of their narratives. Yet she was constrained by time, by court rulings, and by the overwhelming resources of the prosecution. Every question was a delicate maneuver, every pause a calculated risk. The courtroom drama intensified during the testimony of Maria Rodriguez, the waitress who had served Daniel for years. Her presence, however, was fraught with tension. She was undocumented, and the act of testifying placed her at risk of deportation. The prosecution sought to use her vulnerability to undermine Daniel's case, but Walsh's careful guidance allowed Maria to tell the truth without exposing herself unduly. Her testimony illuminated Daniel's character, a man of patience, integrity, and courage, whose military service had shaped him into a disciplined, honorable individual. As the day progressed, the trial became a study in contrasts. The prosecution wielded fear and exaggeration as weapons, while the defense relied on calm, methodical exposition of facts. Each side presented its version of reality, and the jury was left to navigate the murky waters of perception and prejudice. By late afternoon, Daniel found himself reflecting on his own journey. From the jungles of Southeast Asia to the quiet halls of the community college, his life had been defined by discipline, courage, and service. Now, in the courtroom, those same qualities were under attack. Yet he remained steadfast, knowing that integrity and truth were allies no less powerful than the military tactics he had once employed. As the first day of trial concluded, Daniel returned to his cell, weary but unbroken. The shadows of the courthouse loomed behind him, a reminder of the challenges still ahead. Yet within him burned a quiet determination to navigate this labyrinth of lies, to survive the orchestrated fear, and to emerge with honor intact. The courtroom doors closed behind Daniel Mercer with a finality that seemed almost ceremonial in its cruelty. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the murmurs of the spectators and the subtle rustle of papers. Daniel's heart remained calm, steady, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of fear, prejudice, and orchestrated lies surrounding him. Yet beneath that calm exterior, a storm of calculated vigilance brewed. He knew this day would mark a critical turning point in the battle for his honor and freedom. The prosecution had refined their narrative to perfection. The teenager's testimonies, rehearsed and distorted, painted Daniel as a cold, menacing figure, one who used his military training to intimidate civilians. Each word, carefully chosen, implied threat, instilling doubt and fear in the jury's mind. Daniel observed, calculating, his experience in tactical assessment now applied to courtroom psychology. Every twitch, every hesitation, every small movement was catalogued, analyzed, and prepared to be countered. Dr. Marcus Webb returned to the stand, now emboldened by the jury's receptive nods. He expounded theories about latent aggression in combat veterans, leaning heavily on statistical speculation rather than evidence. Daniel recognized the danger immediately. The jury was swayed by authority, not truth. He prepared mentally for Jennifer Walsh's cross-examination, knowing it would be a delicate dance between exposing falsehoods and avoiding the ire of a biased judge. Then came Tyler Morrison's moment on the stand. Daniel's eyes remained fixed on the young man, noting the tension in his posture, the fleeting glances to the prosecutor for reassurance. The teenager delivered his rehearsed account of the morning at Murphy's diner, each detail exaggerated, to create an atmosphere of intimidation. Tyler's voice wavered under Walsh's pointed questioning, revealing cracks in the story carefully constructed by the prosecution. Outside, the courthouse steps had become a theater of conflict. Protesters clashed with supporters of Daniel, their voices carrying through the cold morning air. Television cameras captured every angle, broadcasting a narrative of chaos and fear. Social media amplified the spectacle, reducing Daniel's complex reality to a series of sensationalized clips and captions. In a world of perception, the truth was an inconvenient detail. As the trial progressed, Daniel's cell back at Moran County Jail became his sanctuary and his strategy room. He replayed testimonies in his mind, noting every inconsistency, every opportunity for counterattack. He knew that the real battlefield extended beyond the courtroom walls. It lay in public opinion, in the hearts of the jurors, in the minds of those who held power over his fate. Jennifer Walsh worked tirelessly, piecing together Daniel's past, calling upon former colleagues, students, and community leaders. Each witness painted a picture of a man who had devoted his life to service, integrity, and mentorship. Yet each testimony had to battle against the overwhelming weight of fabricated fear. High noon brought a new wave of tension. The prosecution called Officer Michael Patterson to testify. His statements, as expected, were embellished. He described Daniel's demeanor as threatening, interpreted ordinary gestures as signs of aggression, and recast a moment of measured vigilance as a prelude to violence. The courtroom seemed to bend under the weight of these distortions. Daniel, sitting with unshaken composure, allowed the words to wash over him, storing them as material for rebuttal. The afternoon brought an unexpected twist. Evidence of the teenager's fabricated statements surfaced, threatening to destabilize the prosecution's carefully constructed narrative. Whispers rippled through the courtroom as Jennifer Walsh seized upon these inconsistencies, methodically highlighting contradictions and gaps. Daniel could sense the subtle shift in the air, the jury beginning to see shadows of doubt where once there had only been the glow of fear. Yet the pressure remained relentless. The prosecution's closing arguments were a masterclass in manipulation, leveraging every piece of fabricated evidence, every distorted testimony, to create an impression of calculated menace. Daniel's calm, collected demeanor was twisted to appear calculating, his military service reinterpreted as preparation for violence rather than proof of discipline. As the day drew to a close, Daniel returned to his cell, muscles tense but spirit unbroken. He knew the war was far from over, that the path to vindication would be fraught with peril. Yet the first cracks in the prosecution's facade gave him a measure of hope. In the shadows of betrayal, he remained resolute, determined to see truth prevail against orchestrated deception. The courtroom seemed to close in on Daniel Mercer, like the walls of a tomb. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting long, distorted shadows across the polished wooden floors. Every creak of the benches, every cough from the spectators, amplified the intensity of the day. Daniel's mind remained razor-sharp, a disciplined sentinel guarding against the tide of falsehoods threatening to consume him. The prosecution had escalated its tactics. They presented fabricated documents, manipulated photographs, and cherry-picked testimonials, all designed to paint Daniel as a man capable of extreme violence. Officer Patterson's earlier testimony had been embellished, but now new witnesses were introduced, each coached meticulously to heighten the image of menace. Tyler Morrison and his friends, previously rehearsed but faltering under cross-examination, now trembled under the intense glare of the courtroom. Their voices cracked as they repeated claims about the morning at Murphy's Diner, portraying a simple confrontation as a harrowing threat. Daniel observed their anxiety with a calm detachment, noting every micro-expression, every sign of overcompensation. He understood tactics, he understood fear. He had wielded both on battlefields far from this courtroom. The defense struggled against the onslaught of deception. Jennifer Walsh, exhausted but resolute, tirelessly challenged every inconsistency, every exaggerated detail. She pointed to discrepancies in timelines, contradictions in statements, and highlighted the lack of concrete evidence. Yet the judge's rulings limited the impact of her arguments. Character witnesses were restricted, and the jury's perception was subtly steered by courtroom authority and media influence. Amid the chaos, Daniel's reflections grew darker. Memories of the battlefield, firestorms, ambushes, the screams of the wounded, intertwined with the torment he faced now. The courtroom, the jail, the city outside, they had become extensions of a crucible, testing his endurance and resolve. His discipline, cultivated over decades of military service, became the only shield against the systematic assault on his honor. The prosecution's strategy culminated in psychological warfare. Dr. Hicks, a renowned forensic psychologist, took the stand to provide expert testimony about latent aggression in veterans. He had never met Daniel, never reviewed his records, yet spoke with unwavering certainty about the supposed dangers Daniel posed. Each word was a calculated blow, designed to unsettle both the jury and Daniel himself. Walsh countered with precision, eliciting factual clarifications and subtly dismantling the authority of the so-called experts. She highlighted their lack of direct knowledge and their reliance on generalized theories rather than evidence. Yet the relentless weight of the prosecution's narrative continued to loom over the proceedings. The courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. Daniel felt the subtle psychological pressure, small, deliberate manipulations by the prosecution, the pointed glances, the careful phrasing of questions, the timing of objections. Every tactic was meant to provoke, to rattle him, to transform his composed demeanor into evidence of aggression. Outside, the city had become a reflection of the courtroom's chaos. Media coverage painted Daniel as a dangerous, unpredictable figure while protesters and supporters clashed in the streets. Each news segment amplified fear, confusion, and bias. Social media was a battlefield where truth was scarce, replaced by sensationalism and half-truths. Yet even in the darkest moments, Daniel found clarity. He meticulously cataloged each instance of deception, each manipulation, planning future rebuttals. His resolve remained unbroken. The crucible of lies forged in the courtroom only strengthened his commitment to integrity, honor, and eventual vindication. By evening, Daniel returned to his cell, physically exhausted, but mentally vigilant. The flickering fluorescent lights illuminated the contours of his lean, muscular frame, the silver threads in his closely cropped hair, the unwavering calm in his dark, piercing eyes. The jail was silent, yet Daniel's mind raced, analyzing the day's events, anticipating the prosecution's next move, and preparing for the psychological warfare still to come. In this crucible, Daniel Mercer remained unyielding. Lies, manipulation, and orchestrated fear were formidable adversaries, but they were no match for a man whose life had been defined by courage, discipline, and unshakable moral integrity. The first rays of dawn cut through the grimy windows of the Marin County Jail, illuminating dust particles suspended in the stale morning air. Daniel Mercer stirred on the narrow cot, muscles taut, mind alert. The previous day's courtroom onslaught had left him exhausted but unbroken. Today, he knew, the real trial would continue, not in the formal confines of a courthouse, but in the minds of jurors, the scrutiny of media, and the calculated manipulations of those who thrived on fear and spectacle. The prosecution's team had become more relentless. They had unearthed old disciplinary reports, twisted them into instruments of intimidation, and presented them as evidence of latent aggression. Each file, each testimony meticulously framed to imply that Daniel's decades of service were a warning sign, not a badge of honor. Jennifer Walsh worked tirelessly alongside him, poring over the voluminous records, cross-referencing dates, eyewitness statements, and personal histories. Every night, she returned to her small apartment, exhausted but determined, carrying the weight of a case that had already become a public spectacle. Meanwhile, Daniel's mind remained a fortress. He replayed moments in the courtroom, dissecting gestures, voice inflections, and micro-expressions that hinted at deceit. The day of trial opened with a psychological ambush. The prosecution called upon local law enforcement officers and former soldiers, each selected to reinforce a narrative of fear. They spoke of veteran unpredictability and combat-induced aggression, often veering into speculation. Daniel listened, his dark eyes unflinching, silently cataloging every overreach, every misrepresentation. Outside, the city teetered between chaos and fascination. Protesters clashed with supporters, cameras captured moments of heightened emotion, and social media churned with sensationalist headlines. The public's perception of Daniel Mercer was being shaped not by truth, but by fear, prejudice, and the polished manipulation of images and words. Inside the courtroom, tension mounted as Jennifer Walsh called her first witness of the day, a young former student of Daniel's. The student, a bright African-American woman named Talia Monroe, described Daniel's mentorship with reverence, recounting how he had guided students through the most challenging periods of their lives. She spoke of courage, discipline, and integrity, yet each word had to compete against a prosecution narrative saturated with dramatized fears. The cross-examination by the prosecution was merciless. They questioned Talia about her background, attempting to discredit her testimony by implying bias. They probed at the edges of every statement, trying to construct doubt where none existed. Daniel's heart remained steady, his mind calculating each move, anticipating the subtle manipulations, and preparing his defense in silent response. Then came the harrowing moment. A surprise witness, a man claiming to have witnessed Daniel's actions at a distant location years ago. His testimony was inconsistent, vague, yet delivered with such confidence that it threatened to sway the jury. Daniel remained composed, though internally, he felt the familiar stirrings of anger and frustration. His military training had taught him patience, but this was a war of perception rather than bullets. Walsh meticulously dismantled the witness's credibility, revealing gaps and inconsistencies, yet the shadow of doubt lingered. Daniel's thoughts drifted briefly to the past, the jungles of Southeast Asia, the missions he had led, the lives he had saved. Memories of fire and chaos were now intertwined with a new battlefield, one where the enemy wielded lies and manipulation instead of rifles. By evening, the strain was evident. Daniel returned to his cell, body aching from days of rigid posture and mental focus. Yet, in that dim, oppressive space, he found clarity. The crucible had tested him physically, mentally, and morally. Each day, each manipulative attack had strengthened his resolve. Lies and deceit could not erode a life forged in courage, discipline, and unyielding integrity. The shadows outside his cell stretched long and distorted across the walls. Daniel sat on the cot, muscles coiled, eyes glinting with determination. He knew that the gauntlet was far from over. The coming days would challenge his endurance, force him to confront not only orchestrated falsehoods, but also the depths of human prejudice and systemic manipulation. Yet he would endure. He always had. The courtroom had become a theater of shadows. Daniel Mercer sat at the defense table, his lean, muscular frame rigid, silver-streaked hair cropped close, dark eyes piercing through the orchestrated chaos. Every sound, the gavel, the shuffle of papers, the faint murmur from the gallery, struck him like the echo of distant artillery. Today, the prosecution had planned a psychological assault of unprecedented intensity, designed to erode both his credibility and his composure. From the outset, it was clear this trial had transformed into a spectacle of fear. Prosecutor Rebecca. Carla Lely unleashed her full arsenal, manipulated images of Daniel's military service, selective quotations taken out of context, and strategically edited video footage. Each piece was a deliberate distortion, transforming decades of honorable service into a narrative of latent menace. The jury leaned forward, captivated and unsettled. Even minor inconsistencies in Daniel's responses were amplified in their perception, magnified by Carla Lely's subtle suggestions. The courtroom light seemed harsher than usual, casting angular shadows that stretched across Daniel's chiseled features, highlighting the contrast between the dignity of his bearing and the grotesque narrative being constructed around him. Then came the first witness, a supposed expert in veteran behavior, brought in to testify about the dangers posed by aging combat soldiers. He spoke with assured authority, claiming Daniel represented a unique threat to civilian populations, all while having no direct knowledge of Daniel's personal history. Each word landed like a calculated blow, seeking to fracture the mental armor Daniel had honed over decades. Jennifer Walsh countered methodically, meticulously pointing out inconsistencies, but the weight of systemic bias and orchestrated misrepresentation bore down relentlessly. Daniel's mind remained calm, cataloging each tactic, analyzing the jury's micro-expressions, noting every twitch of Carla Lely's lips or subtle hesitation in the witness's testimony. It was a battlefield of perception, and Daniel's discipline was his only weapon. The tension escalated when Tyler Morrison was called again, this time coached to recount the alleged threat with dramatic emphasis. Under cross-examination, he wavered, yet the seed of doubt had already been planted. The jury's eyes flickered between the young witness and Daniel, whose composed, stoic demeanor became a silent canvas upon which fear and prejudice were projected. Daniel's thoughts, however, wandered to darker territories. Memories of ambushes, the faces of enemies and comrades alike, the screams, the firestorms. The traumas of his past merged seamlessly with the orchestrated attacks of the present, creating a psychological storm. Yet even in this maelstrom, his mind remained disciplined. Each emotion was catalogued, each reaction controlled, each strategy honed. The day's climax arrived in the form of a final psychological maneuver. The prosecution played an edited video of the diner incident, intercut with fabricated reactions and speculative voiceovers. The courtroom gasped, the images twisting reality into a tableau of fear and menace. Daniel felt the familiar stirrings of outrage but maintained his composure. He recognized the technique, emotional manipulation masquerading as evidence. Walsh, sensing the critical moment, leaned forward and presented the unaltered evidence, demonstrating the inconsistencies, omissions, and manipulations. The contrast was stark. The prosecution's theatrics versus the quiet, undeniable truth. For a brief moment, the jury was forced to confront reality, yet the psychological toll on Daniel had been immense. His mind and body bore the marks of this crucible. By nightfall, Daniel returned to his cell, the fluorescent lights casting flickering, distorted patterns on the walls. He sat on the cot, back straight, eyes dark and contemplative. He replayed every interaction, every distortion, every strategic assault on his character. Though the system had sought to destroy him, to strip away his dignity, his honor remained intact. The abyss of deception had tested him to the limits, yet he emerged unbroken, mentally preparing for the final act that could either vindicate or destroy him. The dawn was heavy and gray over Indianapolis, a pall of tension lingering from weeks of public scrutiny, media frenzy, and courtroom theater. Daniel Mercer, 66, sat upright on the narrow bench in Pendleton Correctional Facility's visitation room, lean, muscular, silver-streaked hair neatly cropped, eyes alert but reflective. He had endured relentless attacks, psychological, social, and systemic, but the threads of truth, painstakingly woven by his allies, were finally ready to be revealed. It began with Patricia Santos, the investigative journalist who had followed his case with relentless determination. Her articles had meticulously exposed inconsistencies in the prosecution's narrative, highlighting the fabricated testimonies of Tyler Morrison and his friends and the embellished police reports. Each revelation shifted public perception, peeling away layers of deception. Outside, the city simmered with anticipation. Veterans groups organized motorcades along Interstate 70, motorcycles stretching for miles. The air was electric with solidarity, the streets alive with banners reading, "Justice for Daniel Mercer," and "Honor the heroes, expose the lies." Daniel watched from the courthouse steps as faces of support filled the horizon. He felt the weight of decades of service, the cost of a system that had sought to destroy him, and the immense relief that truth was finally surfacing. Inside the courtroom, General Samuel Wyatt, a four-star officer with decades of combat experience, entered with measured gravity. His presence alone commanded attention. Wyatt carried documents that had been suppressed for 50 years, detailing Daniel's valor during the Vietnam War, records of sniper missions that had saved dozens of lives, commendations for bravery, and a lost recommendation for the Congressional Medal of Honor. The courtroom fell into stunned silence, the gravity of the evidence shifting the air. Daniel's eyes, dark and steady, reflected both the horrors he had endured and the quiet satisfaction of vindication. He listened as General Wyatt recounted Daniel's actions, holding off an entire enemy company for 6 hours, coordinating artillery strikes and helicopter evacuations, and saving 37 American lives. The meticulously documented heroism contrasted starkly with the fabricated narrative of menace the prosecution had tried to construct. The prosecution's case unraveled rapidly. Witnesses who had testified under coaching were confronted with undeniable evidence of their falsehoods. The embellished police reports of Michael Patterson and Jennifer Walsh, the arresting officers, were revealed as fabrications influenced by bias and negligence. Their careers ended that day. Federal investigations were launched for civil rights violations. Tyler Morrison, Jake Sullivan, and Brett Collins faced charges for perjury and filing false reports, illustrating the profound consequences of deceit. Daniel remained composed throughout the proceedings, his calm demeanor a testament to the mental fortitude that had carried him through war and incarceration. The jury, witnesses, and spectators all bore witness to the stark contrast between the truth and the lies that had dominated the trial. When the court finally pronounced all charges dismissed with prejudice, the room erupted. Daniel stood, a figure of quiet dignity amidst cheers and applause. Veterans and civilians alike celebrated, some moved to tears. Outside, the motorcade roared past, banners waving, voices lifted in unity and respect. Daniel felt a weight lifted. Decades of injustice finally met with recognition and honor, yet even in triumph, he understood the lingering shadow of systemic prejudice. The case became a catalyst for change. The Veterans Justice Act was passed, mandating special training for prosecutors and judges handling military veteran cases, ensuring oversight and reducing the risk of future miscarriages of justice. In the quiet moments that followed, Daniel walked through the crowd accepting gratitude, handshakes, and quiet nods. A group of black teenagers approached him, inspired by his resilience. "You showed us that even when the system is against you, truth can still win if you don't give up," one said. Daniel's eyes softened, remembering the young Marines he had once led through jungles, the lives he had protected, and the moral victories that had defined his existence. The sun, breaking through the gray dawn, cast long golden streaks over the city. Daniel Mercer, once vilified and imprisoned, now emerged as a symbol of honor, dignity, and unwavering commitment to truth. He had faced the abyss of deceit, emerged resilient, and reclaimed not only his freedom but the respect that had always been his due.